Good evening. My name is Reverend Dr. Rodney Sadler, and I'm pleased to have you join us for this conversation tonight, this hearing that we're looking at the racialization of voting rights in the United States of America. This is the second in a three-part effort to begin to look at the way that voting rights have been prescribed by racial identity in this country over the years. You'll hear a number of great testimonies this evening that delve deeply into this subject, both people who are historical witnesses who share how historically this has taken place, impacted witnesses who are people whose lives have been shaped and changed because of their racial identity as they've tried to engage in voting and ensuring that other people could vote. And then you actually hear at the end of this conversation from a confessing witness, someone who is part of the system, who is identified as one who has power and privilege in this system, but who's decided to work to make sure that everybody has access to the ability to vote. Before we do anything, though, let's look to the Lord to start us off with a word of prayer. Holy One, it's once again that we come before you with thanksgiving in our hearts. We're grateful that you have brought us together as the Reimagining America Project to look at the way that race shapes each and every system in our society. Today, as we wrestle with voting rights, we want to think about the way that voting rights are an expression of human rights, the way that they allow us to participate in our own governance, the way that by refusing these, we are refusing parts of our own humanity. As we gather, we ask that you would not just give us great guidance and let us hear wonderful words from each of our speakers, but help us to see the way forward, that we might work for a more fair, more just, more equitable system going forward. We call on you by many names, Lord, and all of them we remain grateful to you and ask that you would use us for your purposes. Amen. As we begin our conversation tonight, I just want to say welcome. For those of you who may not been a part of the Reimagining America Project before, the Reimagining America Project is literally a group of grassroots leaders who said, we're tired. We're tired of waiting for someone to fix the issue of race in America. We're tired of waiting for someone to come around and begin to do what needs to be done. We're tired of waiting for this long delayed conversation about race that we've been waiting for 403 years as regards Africans in America. No, it's time to do something about it. It's time that we stand up and we develop systems that can help to address the issue of race and racial disparity. It's time that we begin to make the kind of progress towards an America that lives up to her historical credo, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all human beings are created equal, endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. It's time that we manifest that America. And if you believe that, I want to invite you to join with us to work for that more perfect nation, that more perfect state, that more perfect day. Part of doing that means that we're going to have to address voting rights. And when I talk about addressing voting rights, I mean that over the length of time that we've existed as a nation, we've evolved as we've given people access to the right to vote. White men who owned land, other white men were brought in, eventually Black men, but that right was taken away. White women were allowed to vote. Oh, then again, at the Voting Rights Act, Black men and women were added to that larger cadre of people. And then Shelby versus Holder, in essence, upset that apple cart again in 2013. We have come a long way, but we have so much further to go as we wrestle with the issue of access to voting. So tonight we're going to have a number of people that will join us. Among the commissioners that will be part of our hearing tonight are Mayor Jennifer Roberts, Dr. James Beard, Ms. Joanne Jenkins, Ms. Cynthia Perry, Ms. Roxanne Rucker, Ms. Deb Zahn, Ms. Deandra Brooks, and Ms. Samantha Turner. As we come together, like at all points in time, we are an expression of beloved community. We want to give everyone an opportunity to speak, to share their truth, to make sure that their truth is heard. In essence, after you hear from impacted witnesses, you'll actually hear people come to affirm them, to let them know that their voices have been heard as we work towards the kinds of change we would like to see. So sit back and listen to these stories that will be told to you all today. And let's think about how we can come together to make sure that everybody that testifies, every word we heard works towards a greater, more just system. I'll start tonight by introducing you to one of our key leaders. She heads up our education subcommittee as one of our key leaders. She is an activist, a justice warrior in the great state of North Carolina and in the wonderful city of Charlotte, Mecklenburg. Ms. Joanne Jenkins, I want to turn over the floor to you and hopefully give you a little bit more time so that Dr. Chafe might be able to have a few extra minutes for his conversation. I turn it over to you, Joanne.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. The historical witness's role is to, like Rodney said, is to establish this history that we're standing on tonight. So I have the privilege of introducing our first historical witness, Dr. William Chafe, and has a little bit of his story. His professional scholarship reflects his long-term interest in issues of race and gender equality. He's the former dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Duke University, and he's also a past president of the Organization of American Historians. He is an award-winning author of several books and a co-founder of the Duke UNC Center for Research on Women, the Duke Center for the Study of Civil Rights and Race Relations, and the Duke Center for Documentary Studies. And he currently serves as a member of a working group who is dedicated to creating truth, justice, and reconciliation commissions throughout the country. Dr. Chafe?
Thank you so much. It's great to be here with you all. And I want to begin by talking about a long history of Black voting rights in North Carolina. As soon as the war was over, there were a group of people who were committed to being the front runners in changing politics in North Carolina, led by a former Army leader, Abraham Galloway, who was an escaped slave, but who led a division of people in the Union Army. The government in the Reconstruction government in North Carolina was a very successful government because it was the first government that ever took on the issue of providing support for public education. It was approximately 1/3, 2/3 Black and white in terms of the people who held office. And it basically made North Carolina one of the leaders in the Reconstruction movement. But as you know, by 1871, the Ku Klux Klan had become a major force in North Carolina and elsewhere. And then in 1876, in a terrible moment, the Republican president, the person who'd been elected as president, Rutherford B. Hayes, made a deal with former segregationist and secessionist states. If he agreed to withdraw all federal troops from the South and end Reconstruction, the Electoral College voters from Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina would cast their votes for him. And even though he had lost the election by popular vote to Samuel Tilden, he would become the president. He did become president, and all the 100,000 troops of the Union Army left the South, and Reconstruction was over. But that did not mean that Black politics was over. In the 1880s, there was a very significant biracial movement that created the Virginia Readjustment movement in Virginia, and that helped to create a shared effort to not only the voting rights, but also educational rights to everybody within the state, Black or white. That was then succeeded by North Carolina's fusion movement. The fusion movement consisted of people who came from the populist movement, the Black populist movement, and the white populist movement. They met together in the same cities, even though they were not the same organization. The fusion movement was incredibly successful from 1894 to 1898 in terms of public education, in terms of providing welfare rights for people, in terms of building roads. And it was a group that was essentially, office holders were about 35 to 40% Black, and the rest of them were white. And then in 1898, the best white men of North Carolina. We all often they themselves as being almost aristocrats, including Josephus Daniels of the Raleigh News and Observer and Charles Aycock, who was going to be the Democratic candidate for governor. They together started to circulate throughout the entire state a letter which claimed that Black men were out to rape white women. And that became the point of rallying the entire white population to vote against the fusion government and to put in place the governorship of Charles Aycock. That in turn led 3 years later in 1901 to the elimination of the Black franchise for Black North Carolinians. That had started in 1890 in Mississippi, but North Carolina was one of the last and most vibrant biracial governments to exist. And so from that point forward, you have just a struggle to keep on fighting to get the franchise. W. Du Bois starts the NAACP in 1909. There is a systematic campaign during the 1920s to continue to sustain Black support. And then during the New Deal, you have the beginnings of a relationship between the administration in Washington and the civil rights struggle. And that's largely because of Eleanor Roosevelt, who together with A. Philip Randolph, who was the president of the Brotherhood of the Sleeping Car Porters Union, an all-Black union, led to a meeting in which Franklin Roosevelt agreed to create the Fair Employment Practices Commission, which opened up job opportunities for millions of Black people who were migrating north, but also in the cities in the South. And the civil rights movement goes on from there. It is incredibly strengthened by World War II, when Blacks have an enormous presence in the Army and Navy. And even though they do combat training in segregated southern areas, they then spend their time in liberated areas, and after World War II become the basis for the civil rights movement of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. What's really important about that is that North Carolina is once again in the forefront. And you have people like Ella Baker. Ella Baker is the person who was one of the founders of the NAACP and who during World War II went to every city in the South to try to create NAACP chapters. And because of her work over 4 years, the NAACP goes from a group of 50,000 to a group of 400,000. She is incredibly important. Ella Baker also then becomes one of the instruments of the civil rights struggle. In 1960, there are 4 sit-in students from Greensboro A&T who start what becomes a revolution. The 4 students who sit in at Woolworth's demanding equal treatment become 23 the next day, then 66, then 100, and then on the fifth day, 1,000 people, Black people come to downtown Greensboro. Ella Baker then convenes a group of sit-in demonstrators. The sit-ins, by the way, it spread to 54 cities in 9 different states by April 8th. She creates the conference that led to the development of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which becomes the cutting edge of the civil rights struggle. So that is the basis on which Black voting rights become a primary concern. People like Terry Sanford are very supportive of civil rights as governors of North Carolina, and so was Jim Hunt. And basically, you move toward a point in time when civil rights struggle has become a major force in North Carolina, led by people like sit-in demonstrators in Greensboro and the NAACP and all the people who helped to make today's world possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chafe. And I am grateful that this is being recorded because I learned several new things listening to you. Thank you. Thank you. Our next historical witness is Kamaria Lawrence, and she grew up in the Charlotte area and went to university in Greensboro and at Clark in Atlanta. She registered her first voter at age 6, and voting rights have been a long major part of her life. And she comes to us tonight as Democracy North Carolina Regional's organizing manager after a 7-year career in electoral politics, beginning with Organizing for America. Camaria has organized for political and issue campaigns here in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Alabama. She is a member of her church's social justice ministry, introducing noteworthy community programming on the electoral process and voter rights. And she is a member of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority and serves as the Mid-Atlantic region's co-chair for the Connection Committee, which works with voter rights and education. Thank you for joining us tonight and sharing, Camaria.
Thank you so much for the invitation to to give a contribution to this important discussion. So as it was already shared, I work at Democracy North Carolina. Good evening, I'm Camaria Lawrence. I work as the Western Piedmont Regional Director, covering Mecklenburg, Cabarrus, Gaston, and Union counties. And I'm just going to give you a brief history of voter suppression in North Carolina. Some of this was touched on in the previous testimony, but I just want to give a brief update from our research department, our advocacy department. But let's start here. So, voter suppression and white supremacy in North Carolina, as we've learned, it's been a real thing in our state. When the US Constitution was ratified, only white landowners were routinely permitted to vote or hold state office, ultimately creating a democracy dominated by white men and their political priorities. Before the Civil War, North Carolina lawmakers were required to own a minimum of 100 to 300 acres of land to serve in the General Assembly. The overwhelming majority of legislators holding office were slave owners. North Carolina amended its constitution in 1875, stripping people with felony records of the right to vote. Due to the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, this was done specifically to disproportionately impact Black voters. Now, that moves us into the Jim Crow era laws. After the Civil War, Black Americans had access to political power in new ways. This led to growing solidarity between Black and white North Carolinians who lacked financial and community resources. In response, the General Assembly passed voting laws designed to prevent these groups from gaining political power and ultimately having access to resources like quality education, healthcare, jobs, and transportation. During the Jim Crow era, laws were written to appear as if they applied to everyone, but their intent and impact were to burden and prevent Black and brown North Carolinians from accessing the ballot box. Election officials became gatekeepers for those who could and could not vote, and in the process continued to uphold white supremacy. So then we take a look at lawmakers. They created a series of laws and practices to entrench their power by targeting Black people's ability to vote in the form of literacy tests, poll taxes, and use of police violence. Now, the literacy test, to vote, North Carolinians had to prove to election officials that they could read and write. In 1900, nearly half of Black and non-white North Carolinians were illiterate. Men who were eligible to vote or descendants of those eligible to vote before 1867 were exempted from the rule through the grandfather clause. This exemption did not include any Black voters. So the literacy test denied most Black people the opportunity to vote. Now, the poll tax, North Carolinians also had to pay a tax before casting their ballot, a clear barrier to exercising the right to vote, particularly in the Black community, even if low wealth people could afford to pay the tax. The time to pay was during the planting season, when Black sharecroppers often did not have cash. So we think about that. Police violence. Police were known for shutting down voter registration drives and hanging around polling places in communities across the South, serving as a form of voter intimidation. Now, modern voter suppression law and tactics. The legacy of the Jim Crow era is still present in the state of North Carolina. Although the literacy test and poll tax are no longer in force, there are still laws, policies, and practices that uphold the discriminatory effect on voters of color. These voting and election laws intersect with other oppressive practices to compound the lived experiences that restrict, deny, or undermine Black voter participation. Gerrymandering, every 10 years, when we do our census, that's why it's important to participate. The North Carolina General Assembly and local governing bodies, such as the county commissioner, city council, and school boards, adjust the district lines where voters live based on population changes from the US Census. This process is called redistricting. Now, gerrymandering occurs when a party in power draws districts that politically favor or disfavor a particular race or party. The goal of gerrymandering is to entrench one party's power by packing voters into as few districts as possible, or cracking. You may have heard the term cracking and packing before. This is to crack voters by separating them into different districts. This dilutes the voters' power. In North Carolina, gerrymandering is often used to dilute and minimize the voting power of Black and Latinx people. In 2011, the General Assembly used redistricting to give Republicans a supermajority in future elections. Those maps were heavily litigated over the next decade. Certain districts were deemed racially gerrymandered and struck down by the US Supreme Court in 2017. In 2019, a 3-judge trial court once again struck down the redrawn districts, but this time on partisan grounds. Now, felony disenfranchisement. In 1875, and we did hear about the 1800s a lot earlier. In 1875, felony disenfranchisement laws were added to the North Carolina Constitution shortly after adopting the 14th and 15th Amendment to the US Constitution, which provided the right to vote for Black men. North Carolinians who are serving a felony sentence are barred from voting. Today, you may hear somebody say that they're on paper. When you're doing voter registration, I always ask, are you on paper? And sometimes say, yes, if you're on paper, you have an active felony charge. You owe time or funds to the state. But if you're off paper, you owe nothing to the state of North Carolina and are able to register and vote. So going back, Black and Latinx communities are the primary targets of the prison industrial complex in the United States. Leading to their disproportionate disenfranchisement, the Sentencing Project estimates that almost half of the 83,000 North Carolinians who cannot vote due to a felony conviction are Black, yet only 20% of North Carolinians are Black. So I have nothing Christ-like to say there. So I'm saying nothing about that, but I'm going to continue to work to eradicate that. Voter identification, voter ID. Laws require voters to present a specific type of identification when voting. Voter ID disproportionately affects senior citizens. I think about my own grandmother, who was born in 1919, Red Summer, the summer with the highest number of recorded lynches of Black people. My grandmother never drove. She got everywhere she needed to be, but she did not have a vehicle. She never learned how to drive. She was a service worker. I don't know if service worker is the best. She was a maid, she was a nanny. And she didn't need an ID. She of course had a social security card, but no photo ID. If these laws pass, then my grandmother could not vote. My grandmother has never broken a law, but if she tried to vote, she would have committed a felony. While if voter ID laws were in effect. While Black people make up 23% of registered voters in North Carolina, they account for 34% of those with no photo ID. Socioeconomic factors such as transportation, education, healthcare, and occupation also impact the ability to get an ID to vote. Even an ID that is labeled as free, which doesn't account for the time spent and wages lost to acquire the ID. Because a lot of people will have to take off time from work to go and get that ID. And some people cannot afford to lose that time because they're working at an occupation where they're working hourly. So that there is an obvious roadblock. In 2018, North Carolinians voted to amend the Constitution to require voter ID, but the General Assembly did not provide voters with information on how this law would be enacted or what type of ID would be required. The law enacting the constitutional amendment was also racially discriminatory, and voters were not required to present voter ID in the 2020 election. Challenges to voter ID continue as we approach the 2022 elections. And if we keep going back and forth, that causes confusions. And some people might say, well, just forget it, I won't vote. So we want to make sure that we're giving factual information. And I always refer people to the law. Stick with the law and go with that information. If the law is not for you, then work legally to fight the law. Voter intimidation and violence. Voter intimidation is the use of force, threats, or coercion to interfere with a person's right to vote. Although federal and North Carolina laws protect voters from some forms of voter intimidation, it does not take into account the history and lived experiences of Black and Latinx voters. In 1898, white supremacists in the thriving majority Black city of Wilmington murdered between 60 to 300 Black residents, burned Black businesses, drove the recently elected Black Board of Aldermen out of office, and forced Black families to flee from the city. This is captured in the film Wilmington on Fire. So if you're not familiar with the story, please watch this factual film. It's a great resource for education. The 2020 election was a spike in reports of voter intimidation in North Carolina and across the United States. Police officers in Alamance County pepper sprayed voters and their families during a march to the polls. And we think about our Souls to the Polls marches. This could be us. So we need to work together. On Election Day in Mecklenburg County, an armed supporter of President Trump posted up at a polling site was ordered to leave following reports of intimidating voters and still returned to continue his intimidation. I actually was at this particular location and it was ridiculous. This happened in the university area of Charlotte. And disinformation, we learned a lot about that in the last presidential term. Disinformation refers to any information circulated with the intent to mislead potential voters about their electoral rights or an upcoming election. One of North Carolina's most famous disinformation campaigns occurred in 1990, when then US Senator Jesse Helms sent postcards to 100,000 Black North Carolinians with incorrect voting information, as well as threatening jail time during his re-election campaign. Disinformation today can also be unintentional or passive due to the nature of social media algorithms and amplification. Reposting and trending topics features on social media dictated election coverage in 2016 and 2020. As social media continues to grow more quickly than it is regulated, such disinformation will likely pervade future elections. So always cite your sources, as they said in graduate school, cite your sources. Election methods across the South. There is a history of changing election administration methods and logistics to suppress Black voters and limit Black political power. Large elections are when all voters in a city or county vote for the candidates of their choice running for all offices that will represent the entire city or county. This is different from single member districts, also known as district elections, when only voters who live in a particular district located in the city or county vote for candidates running to represent the particular district. In North Carolina, the selection of at-large district elections may have a discriminatory impact on Black communities because they cannot elect their candidates of choice. Therefore, it is essential to look at the city or county's history and voting patterns before determining if the election method suppresses or reduces Black political power. For example, in Jones County, at-large elections prevented Black voters from electing a Black commissioner for 23 years, from 1994 to 2017, even though Black people make up 1/3 of the voting age population. After a lawsuit filed by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, 2 seats were added to the board and elections were held in single member districts. Currently, 2 commissioners on the board are Black. Now, list maintenance practices, and I don't want to go on and on, but list maintenance practices. List maintenance is the process states use to maintain accurate and current voter registration, lists, or voter rolls. Accurate list maintenance ensures voters are only removed when they become ineligible due to relocation, death, or felony conviction. List maintenance that is too aggressive or based or false information can result in the removal of eligible voters. In North Carolina, list maintenance disproportionately impacts registered Black voters in comparison to white voters, especially in the eastern part of the state. In 2021, Black voters were 7.21% overrepresented among voters who were removed compared to their share of the electorate. Inaccurate and faulty list maintenance practices can be used to suppress voters of color, and there have been attempts through policy to publicize their information, which could be used for vigilante attacks to intimidate people not to vote.
Ms. Lawrence, thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much.
That was a lot.
Yeah, well, no, but I want to thank you and I want to thank Dr. Chafe for laying the foundation. And now we are going to turn it over to Commissioner Roxanne Roker, who will bring on witnesses now to talk about what this history that you have told us about tonight, how it feels and how it works. Thank you all very much. Roxanne.
Yes, thank you, Ms. Jenkins, and thank you so much, Ms. Lawrence, for that very comprehensive review of the structural barriers to voting. We're now going to hear from impacted witnesses, those whose lived experience share some of the stories of running into these structural barriers that we just heard about. I'd like to introduce first off Ms. Thelma Byers-Bailey. She's a native of Charlotte, graduated from West Charlotte High School before earning bachelor's degrees in both physics and math from Fisk University. She then went on to attain her law degree from St. Louis University Law School and a master's degree as well in a joint degree program. Moved to California, where she established a long record of community service, practicing law, president of a number of associations and an active member of the California State Bar Conference of Delegates. She has since retired and returned home to Charlotte, still playing very active roles in serving the community, the Lincoln Heights Neighborhood Association, Friendship Community Development Corp Board of Directors, and the African American Community Funds Board of Directors. And in addition to all of that, she finds time to tutor 4th and 5th grade students and to mentor 8th grade students at Walter G. Byers School. So thank you so much, Ms. Byers-Bailey, with all of that going on and making time. I'm going to turn it over to you for your comments.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. As it was mentioned, I grew up here in Charlotte, and I was during the Jim Crow era, so I'm not a spring chicken. That was when education was separate but equal, and that was the accepted norm in the Black community. Because the Black community where I lived then and still live, is on the upper edge of Charlotte. I felt I was isolated from the white community and did not interact with them at all. I used to visit my aunt who lived in Brooklyn and in New York, and she would take me to the amusements parks in Coney Island and Rockaway Beach. And I enjoyed those events very much. But when I come home and I would see local amusement activities here and there in the community, I would ask him, my daddy, well, why can't I go over there? And he would say I couldn't, but he never would tell me why. And I never really understood that. As I grew up in the segregated education schools, my parents were both educators. And so I enjoyed a good education. But I was also aware by the time I was in middle school, elementary school, I think, I was also aware of the Dorothy Counts and her family and the efforts that she had gone through trying to attend a white high school here in Charlotte. That trauma, I was aware of that trauma and as she endured her attempts to attend there, and it was quite painful. We all were aware. I finished West Charlotte and I entered, as I was going off to go to Fisk University, my dad made me fully aware, because he had been made aware, that if by that time we were having sit-ins and those kinds of activities all over the South, and it had been made, been made aware that if I participated in any kind of an activity of sit-in, that he and my mother would lose their jobs. So when I got to Fisk, I was cautious in my efforts, but I just could not resist participating. I got there after Diane Nash and John Lewis were doing the sit-ins, the bus rides through the South for the Freedom Rides. So I did not get a chance to participate in that, but I was able to participate in the sit-ins, the picketing of Woolworths in Nashville, which was ultimately integrated. But I never told my dad that I participated. When I got home during the summer, some of my friends had been participating in the picketing here and had gone to jail. And so we would go down, I'd grab some of my friends and we would go down to the jail uptown and sing outside to encourage our classmates who were in the jail, but I never told my parents about that either. So that pretty much is how the Jim Crow era impacted my life, and how my parents limited my ability to participate as I wanted to in the activities. But that was what Jim Crow did. It limited your life. And it ultimately is part of the reason why I ultimately ended up going to law school and getting involved in the law that way.
Thank you very much, Ms. Byers-Bailey. I'd like to ask a couple of questions. And you heard Ms. Lawrence talk about some of the structural barriers to voting and given your background and what you've seen and lived through, I'm hoping that you can share with us, how does the presence of these structural barriers and activities to suppress the vote, how has that impacted your sense of democracy?
It has made me very determined to vote every time I have an opportunity. I did not come back home to Charlotte until the 1990s, but all the times that no matter where I lived, whether it was in the country or out of the country, I always voted here in Charlotte by absentee ballot. So it made me, those experiences made me just determined to participate in that process, and understand how important it is. My granddaughter was living with me during the last election, and she was studying in the library at Smith, and she hadn't voted. And I went up there and got her, drug her out of the library over to the polling place, and she was the last person to get in to vote. But I just made it real clear to her, this is not optional. You must do this.
Yep. That's good to hear. Hey, I wonder also, given your work with students and of course having grandkids, what do you think we should be teaching students to help them really understand both the struggle for voting rights as well as why it's important for them to participate in civic life, participate in their government this way?
I think what they need to see is people who are in government. They need to see our Black politicians. They need to get up close and personal and understand what it is we do and why it's important. All politics, the most important politics is local politics. They need to understand and get to know our city council people and what it is a city council does and why it is important that a minority is sitting in that seat and making those decisions, because those decisions impact their lives, those student lives. The decisions I make on the school board impacts students' lives, and that's what they don't get.
Absolutely. Well, I thank you so much for your comments, and I'm going to turn it over to Mayor Jennifer Roberts, our affirming commissioner.
Thank you, Roxanne and Thelma. I just love your stories. I love your determination, and amazing that you carried on voting even when you were out of the country, absentee. Hearing your stories of protests and of exclusion and barriers that were put up, and you just kept on going. I am so admiring of you, and you're very inspirational, and you are helping direct our educational policy, which was a huge barrier when there was a literacy test to people of color. And you are at the forefront of changing things. I'm so grateful. Thank you for your words tonight. Thank you for that history that we need our young people to hear, because freedom isn't free, and voting is so important, and it has not been accessible. We need to continue to struggle to make sure it is. Thank you so much for your words tonight.
Thank you, Mayor Roberts, and thank you again, Ms. Byers-Bailey, for joining us. I'd now like to introduce you to our second impacted witness, Kendrick Cunningham. Kendrick, some of you may know, is running for Charlotte City Council District 2. He's particularly focused on upward mobility and system transformation, and is tirelessly working to register youth to vote and increase his generation's capacity to impact change in North Carolina for now and into the future. He's also a United Nations Association emerging leader, and as such, he knows that the UN anticipates Charlotte to be the fastest growing area in America through 2030. Now let that set in a moment. And he sees the urgency now in organizing to revolutionizing housing for Charlotte residents and remove barriers for working families and communities in accessing housing at affordable prices in Charlotte. His vision is that one day all Charlotte residents can affordably eat, work, play, where they sleep there in Charlotte. So thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Cunningham, and I'll turn it over to you for your remarks.
No problem. Thank you for that introduction, Roxanne. And I'm about to sing my favorite song, and I'm about to share my screen. Can everyone see my screen?
We cannot.
I'm sorry. Well, it's not going to let me share my screen, but I can just go ahead and free fall it. But good evening, everyone. I'm Kendrick Cunningham. As Roxanne said, I'm running for Charlotte City Council District 2, and I'm also the president of the Young Democrats of Mecklenburg County. Tonight, I will talk to you all a little bit about how I have been impacted by voter suppression as a college student in my professional career as a Charlotte voter. While I was in college, and this is going to be brief too, but while I was in college during the 2016 presidential election, I got very engaged on my campus. Our university president had challenged me to increase voter turnout on our campus, and I accepted that challenge. And before I had accepted that challenge, our campus turnout was 13%. And we did a lot of work in engaging our students. We had touch points of up to 5 in some cases, and influencing students to get out to vote. But when it came to election day, I got to the polls and I was not able to cast my ballot because there was, I can't remember what exactly was the catch-22, but there was an ID law in place where my college student ID would not have been accepted like it would have been in prior years to show my proof of residence. And our university president kind of broke it down to me to understand that when Republicans in North Carolina often refer to voter fraud, one of the things that they are talking about are liberal college students who come from out of state but change their voter registration so that they can exercise their democracy in in the city that their college is in. And when voter ID laws are implemented during elections, it heavily impacts young voters because we are cost burdened. So in many cases, especially as a college student, we don't have the $13 at expense to pay for the ID right on demand. And then also most young people are full-time college students, so we have very demanding schedules. So that was one way that I experienced voter suppression. It kind of made me feel a little bit down because that was a very historical election and I wasn't able to have my vote casted. And I remember sitting in the cafeteria we had a watch party in our cafeteria and watching Donald Trump win. And I'm like, oh, wow, my one vote could have been the one vote that possibly changed the election. And then as a Charlotte voter, so I was born and raised in Charlotte, and I grew up in the historic Camp Green community. And the historic Camp Green community is in this community, a community of interest that I identified with an organization called All on the Line that works to spread awareness about redistricting across the nation. And pretty much inside of the historic Southwest corridor, which is Indley Park, Camp Green, West Boulevard, and South Boulevard communities, we are subjected to extreme Republican gerrymandering. And if I could have shared my screen, I had some examples to show you how even in the current maps that was passed by the General Assembly, you can literally see, I like to call the historic Southwest corridor the epicenter of Republican gerrymandering in Charlotte, because in most cases, our community is always either split in half. It's split in half in the new congressional maps that were passed. It's also split in half in the state Senate maps, the state House maps, and the Charlotte City Council maps. So for me as like a deeply rooted community leader and a community organizer in my neighborhood, it's kind of like it makes me feel very depressed. Not want to say all depressed, but when we are constantly always asking our elected officials to allow us to vote as like a whole community, and when we're trying to make sure that we have the representatives that we know will be responsive to our needs and issues, it complicates the process for us getting ourselves all together, and it makes us have to go to more than one individual in order to get one thing done for our communities. So in that sense, experiencing voter suppression in that way just makes me very frustrated, but I enjoy calling out, people for suppressing voters. So that's another way that I've experienced voter suppression.
Hey, thank you so much for sharing both of those examples of the barriers for you being able to, you and your community being able to exercise your vote. Hey, Mr. Cunningham, you talked about the student ID, and I assume that impacted not only you, but others who were similarly situated. And I admire your tenacity to, try to get it done and to have those conversations. What do you think the impact was on other students, other young men like yourself trying to vote?
I think in that one particular moment, being that we raised our voter turnout on campus from 13 to 38%, a lot of people felt very inspired in the fact that we exercised democracy, that we knew that there was something at stake in our nation, and that we, like, in a time, like, in history, like, it's going to say that St. Augustine's University stepped up and we made the right choice. But also, in a sense, seeing, all of us rally around, and also seeing Donald Trump win, it made us like more stronger as a united body of people to really go out and make change happen for our communities.
So it deepened, sounds like it deepened your resolve. And so I'm glad to hear that folks were still inclined to participate in the process. And then you also spoke very eloquently and around gerrymandering. And, I'm sure some are maybe thinking like, hey, both parties are guilty of gerrymandering. So what makes it such a critical issue for you in this election cycle?
In this election cycle, what makes gerrymandering or redistricting as a whole such a critical issue is because I think one of the things that's often said is that America has become too big to govern. And when we're looking at how we're situating our districts here in North Carolina, that we're not creating compact districts representative to actual communities itself. So I felt like this was, especially for the Charlotte City Council, I felt this was a dynamic opportunity for us to really create compact districts where people could elect someone that was from their community and also representative of their issues that they were concerned about.
So true communities of interest. Mm-hmm. Thank you so very much, Kendrick Cunningham, for sharing your story and those incredibly insightful examples. I'm going to turn it over to Mayor Jennifer Roberts again, our affirming commissioner.
Thanks again. And Mr. Cunningham, thank you for sharing your story. I'm very moved by your personalization of what the district lines changing has meant to you, I can't imagine you took all this effort to increase voter turnout, among your peers, and then you encountered an obstacle. I mean, that's so frustrating. And you're absolutely right. The laws have been changed and the lines have been changed to confuse people on purpose, especially people of color. And you're so inspiring that you are, taking your experience and you want to have a voice, and you also emphasize the importance of that local input, of that compact district, of the neighborhood not being split down the middle because there are similar interests and folks who are represented in that neighborhood. And so thank you so much for sharing your story. Thank you for your courage and your determination to continue to have a voice, because we need your voice. And just to say, that is not a campaign endorsement. I also want to remind our listeners that the Reimagining America Project is a nonpartisan organization. We have Republicans, we have Democrats, we have unaffiliated who are part of our commission work. And the key is people having a voice and being heard. So, Mr. Cunningham, thank you again for sharing your story with us tonight.
Thank you, Commissioner Roberts.
All right, thank you again, and thank you for the nonpartisan reminder. So let me introduce our third, and this is our third or fourth, four impacted witnesses, Mr. Brandon Rivers, who's also was born in Charlotte and spent most of his childhood in the neighborhoods of Hidden Valley, and also neighborhoods to the southwest portion of Charlotte, Nation Fords Road. He graduated from E.E. Waddell High School and North Carolina Central University, where he went on afterwards to hold various marketing positions before finding his way to his current calling with You Can Vote, a nonpartisan organization focused on empowering, educating, and registering voters in underrepresented communities. Mr. Rivers brings firsthand experience with racism and how it impacts every aspect of his life, including voting. I was touched by his bio because he said he prays that his experience will help us all gain more information on how we can build better together as a community. So with that, Mr. Rivers, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm so glad to be here. Like everybody says, my name is Brandon Rivers. I'm from Charlotte, North Carolina. I'm born and raised. I work with You Can Vote. We're a nonpartisan organization, and we focus on voter education, voter registration, and empowerment. And just being from the city of Charlotte, I speak from my heart, because I work in the field. I work in I'm working underrepresented communities. I work in minority communities, and a lot of times they don't understand the term gerrymandering. They don't understand, different words and different vocabulary. So sometimes you have to break it down. I've experienced racism from being pulled over to being, taken downtown just for not having an ID, to being falsely accused of many crimes in my life. And trust me, it's really not a good feeling. But one of the things that I try to focus on now is voter education. And one of the things that I see from suppression right now is that we really don't focus on voter education. We focus on campaigns, we focus on advocacy groups, we focus on candidates, but we do not focus on what the main focus is, which is voting. A lot of times during what we call GOTV time, which a lot of people are not familiar with, which means get out to vote. You'll see campaigns, you'll see candidates, you'll see organizations doing soul-to-poll events. You'll see them in Black, Latino, LGBTQ plus communities, doing campaigning, doing all these types of activities, taking pictures, rallying down the streets. And then once the election's over, they're gone. They're not even coming back to pick up the yard signs that they left there. If you go to the Hidden Valley neighborhood during November, you'll see, lines of rows of campaign signs saying, vote for this person, vote for this person, vote for this. But you won't see anything after that. Most of these people do not know what the next primary election date is. The primary date changes and people are not aware of this. Most people aren't as social conscious to watch, television shows like CNN, MSNBC, and Fox News to follow the day-to-day political day-to-day operations. So we just go through it. One thing I have learned through working in the minority and underrepresented communities that they want to focus on what's important for them, their self-interest. They want to know what is voting going to mean for me. If they don't see what it means for them, they're not going to vote. They're not going to vote. they need to know what this person is going to do for our community and what they're going to do for me. If it's education, you want to look at voting for your school board. If it's healthcare, you want to look at voting for your county commissioner. If you're focused on criminal justice, most people don't know that their sheriffs are elected officials or their district attorneys are elected officials. Most people do not know that they can focus on on civil rights by going to General Assembly meetings. So I believe that education is the most important key right now to getting voter suppression in the right direction in our underrepresented communities and minority communities. I understand that we have people that want to go in these communities and talk to them like they understand this political lingo, but they don't. When I go to the communities, I ask them, what's the most important thing to you? And they tell me. It could be racism. It could be the police. It can be the schools that their children are attending. And I will let them know what's on the ballot to help them change their situation. So, I'm real passionate what I speak about. And I know we're probably fully aware of what goes on through day to day in the city of Charlotte and the surrounding communities. But one of the things that we really have to focus on is getting inside these communities.
You're muted, Brandon. There you go.
Can you hear me?
We can.
All right. My iPad went out. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you
All right,
fine.
perfect. So I'm not going to take long. I'm on my iPhone now, but that's what we really got to focus on. We got to get in the streets. We got to get in these schools. We got to get on these campuses. We got to do this work all year round. Just not during November, not just during the month of 2 or 3 weeks during the primaries. We got to get out there 365 days a year, 7 days a week, all year round, because most people just think it's one election every 4 years. That's all they think about. People vote personality. They'll say, oh, I don't like this candidate for this. And I'll say, well, give me one issue you don't like about them. That's all they focus on. So we got to get to these people through education, empowering them, and getting everybody registered to vote. If you're not registered to vote, that is the first step in democracy, being registered to vote. So listen, we got a lot of people to speak to. I know we're running late on this webinar, and I can talk for a long time. So let's just get out and vote, you guys. Let's do our part, but let's do it every day. Let's just not hop on a webinar and just make ourselves feel good and then say, hey, I hopped on a webinar tonight and I'm gonna do something in 6 months. No, let's do something today. If it's going out registering voting, if it's going out speaking to vote, if it's out there canvassing, do something.
Hey, Brandon, thank you so much for bringing the energy and bringing the guidance as well. So tell me, what does educating voters need to look like, right? So, if we're there on a sustained basis and if we have the intent to educate, tell me a little bit more about what that actually looks like. I've got my pen. I'm ready to write down the plan. Just go ahead.
I love it. I love it. See, I work for an organization. It's not like a ploy to my organization, but I work for You Can Vote. We're not part of the organization. We have what we call fridge cards. On these cards, they have the general election date, the primary date, and they have the qualifications to be registered to vote. We have a QR code on the back where a person can take their phone out, scan it, go and actually look up and see if they're registered to vote, and we can get them registered to vote on site. We work in local high schools. We go to local colleges, PWIs, HBCUs. We set up tables at events all throughout the city. We clipboard, in front of at the transit uptown Charlotte. We'll stand in line at the DMV and get people registered to vote. So it's just many places. You can do it anywhere. You can go to your church, and say, hey, do you mind if I speak in front of the church and let everybody know that, what the next election day is? So it's the small things that you can do in your community that will really impact their everyday life. So I always tell people, we have lives, we have things to do, but just having fridge cards in your case or sending out a text. So we have pledge sheets where we're able to send out text messages because the primaries were in March 7th. And now they're in May, and if you don't get that information, you sometimes that can be suppression as an own.
Yep. Hey, thanks for stressing that we really have to meet people where they are in the DMV line or wherever else where we can find them. Hey, one last question, Brandon, and then
ma'am.
I'll need to turn it over to Mayor Roberts. But you talked about registering voters, right? Got to get them registered, got to get them registered. There's also a large share of registered voters in our community that are not showing up to the polls. So if you could just give me a few seconds on what you think we need to do to get the push for that registered voter now to the polls.
One of the reasons I always tell people that a lot of people don't go to the polls is because they are not educated that we don't have just one election. You'll be surprised how many people I say, are you registered to vote? They say, oh yeah, I voted in the last election. We have elections every year. So I believe that, we have what we call a pledge to vote system where, we're able to email and text over voting information based on the counties that they're in. A lot of people do not know that once they move, that they need to update their registration. So a lot of the time it's just the education that they don't have. And it's not that they don't want it. It's just that it's not what we call something that people look forward to. It's not like something that you go on Instagram and you're like, hey, let me figure out, some voting information. So it's something that we have to continue to do day by day. And that's why I work every day in the city of Charlotte and surrounding communities, in the ground, on the, in the field, utilizing my platform to do that.
Thank you, Brandon. I feel better knowing that you're using your platform that way. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to our affirming Commissioner, Mayor Roberts.
Hey, Mr. Rivers. Wow. Good to see you. I do a lot of work with, renewable energy. And I think that you could probably light up about 10,000 homes if we could figure out a way to hook you up to the energy grid. Thank you so much for your energy, your enthusiasm, and your focus on education. And, when you talk to all of us about the fact that these politicians show up and they come and tell you things and then they disappear after the vote, that is so important because it makes voters, and especially in neighborhoods, people of color, it makes them feel used, right?
Absolutely.
I'm just a vote. I'm just a check mark on your ballot and then you forget me.
Absolutely.
Oh my gosh, that is like such a good crystallization of being a public servant. And our elected officials need to hear that they are there to serve, not just to come get a vote and go away. So thank you for emphasizing that. Thank you for being in our schools and talking to our young people and being so energetic and having to deal with, getting pulled over for driving while black. I admire you. I'm so glad to be able to see you in person. I know we missed having you at our voting event, but we'll make sure and get you some more opportunities to speak to people, because like I said, you're going to light up thousands of folks and get them to understand it's not just the vote, it's what comes after, and it's
very important
all the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Roberts, and thank you so much again, Mr. Rivers, Brandon Rivers. We're going to move on to our fourth and last impacted witness, Jorge Miyares. He was born in Miami, Florida, to Cuban parents who fled Cuba's authoritarian regime in the early 1960s. He's a first-generation American. And at the age of 22, Mr. Miyares opened up his first business in Jacksonville, Florida, experienced a taste of success there, and then moved to the greater Charlotte area for business, but was really shaken by the civil arrest in 2016 in Uptown. And that turned out to be a pivotal moment for him, a transformative moment. And after meeting with some partners and friends and colleagues, that team decided to create what's now known as Queen City Unity, a Charlotte nonprofit dedicated to the mission of driving equity and equality for all in Charlotte. He has a number of awards and accolades, but I do want to offer that He was appointed to a 3-year term on the City of Charlotte's Charlotte government's Community Relations Committee. He has served as president of the Hispanic American Democrats of Mecklenburg County. And I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Miyares to share his thoughts and comments this evening.
Thank you, Ms. Rucker, and thank you all for having me and for including the Latin American perspective tonight. So when I was 14 years old, or 19 years old rather, I was excited to vote for the first time. And when I arrived at the polls, I clearly remember the man who was at the check-in table, just said I couldn't find my information and I was turned away. I quite frankly, I found it really odd because I clearly remember getting my license 10 months prior to the election and registering to vote. So I was absolutely disillusioned and walked away and didn't return to vote for many, 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 many years. So as a young 19-year-old, I really didn't question it much. I just thought I probably made a mistake when registering. And if that happened today, I'm pretty sure I would handle it very differently. But I was young and just really didn't know any better. So as it turns out, later on, I found out that I was in fact registered to vote, but was inexplicably turned away. And I was absolutely enraged and just became totally disenfranchised. I didn't vote a majority of my 20s because of it. So instances similar to mine, they happen every single election cycle and they just go unquestioned. And to me, it's proof that we have so much more work to do when it comes to the voting rights for Latin Americans and all people of color. And unfortunately, that's just one example, but there's many other examples that affect the Latin American community. One that jumps out at me is that not until too long ago, information about registering to vote on the North Carolina Board of Elections website was not available in Spanish. Now that's no longer the case, but it was a huge reason why so many Latinos and Latinas did not register to vote in North Carolina. You know, the registration process can already be pretty complex for those that are new to our country, and the language barrier, it just didn't make it any easier. Another terrible example of voter suppression is that Black and Latino voters who are successful at submitting an absentee ballot are 3 times more likely to be turned away than white voters in North Carolina. Another one that I think doesn't get enough spotlight is, you know, most people don't know, folks that are born in the island of Puerto Rico, they're citizens of the United States of America. However, they're not allowed to vote in the presidential elections. So think about that. That's over 3 million Latinx American citizens. I'm going to repeat that. 3 million Latinx American citizens whose voices are being absolutely muted, and they have no say in who they get to call Mr. President. So lastly, one of the things I've noticed is many across party lines have invested very little to mobilize non-white young voters. And this coupled with, you know, other egregious forms of voter suppression to diminish the electoral power of Latinos, they're dangerous and truly put our democracy in question. But it goes without saying that there's many in our country, the state of North Carolina and Mecklenburg County, that simply do not want the Latin American community to participate in the electoral process. So it's important that we put an end to this. And I'm grateful for those that fight for the voting rights of my fellow Latin American brothers and sisters. And many of you are here on this call, so thank you. But we've started to see a little bit of a shift due to a lot of folks raising awareness in our community. So I'll give you some examples. From 2016 until now, the amount of Latin American voters in North Carolina has grown by over 25%. So that's over 219,000 new registered Latino voters here in North Carolina. But also between 2016 and 2020, Latinx voter turnout in North Carolina jumped 10 percentage points. So that's huge, and the tide is turning, but we're far from the finish line. So here's the deal. In order for us to really ensure that the voices of the Latin American community are heard, and that we're actively participating in this process, we need a significant investment from both parties, large organizations, and local government. Latino voter registration and engagement, particularly here in Mecklenburg County, has just been left up to small number of nonprofits and independent political organizations. But we need an all hands on deck approach. You know, so what's the low hanging fruit, right? You know, typically in business or anything else that I approach, I say, all right, what's the low hanging fruit? And the low hanging fruit is our young people. You know, young people like me, when I was 19, that became completely disillusioned with our electoral process. And here's some examples as to why. More than half of Latinos ages 18 to 29 who were registered to vote in the November 2020 elections, they had abstained from doing so. Also, individuals ages between 30 and 39 who actually represent 20% of registered Latin American voters, they had very low turnout rates. And I believe that voting is a habit. You know, the very first time I was able to vote and I voted, I have not missed a ballot since. And some Latin American young adults, they're the first ones in their family to be eligible to vote. And they probably have never seen their parents vote because their parents are not citizens, right? So recently, a local Latin American publication, which is known as La Noticia, they conducted a survey of Latin American voters under the age of 39, which is a group that represents, by the way, over 60% of Latino voters here in Mecklenburg County. So these are Mecklenburg County residents who identify as Latinx who did not vote in the November 2020 elections. The poll revealed that the main reason for not voting included lack of time, which I personally believe is due to the lack of flexibility or communication around when the polls are open. They also mentioned their disillusionment with politicians. And above all, the idea that voting just does not generate any change as a major factor as to why they abstained. This narrative is exactly what those that oppress communities of colors want us to believe. It's actually their narrative, and unfortunately, something that I believed as a young adult. Now, how do we drive change and how do we drive Latin American voter engagement? You know, someone mentioned it earlier, and it's education, right? We have to educate our young Latino voters on the importance of the electoral process. We have to educate them on why it makes a difference and why it's really one of the only things that can make a difference. And one thing we need to do is we got to modernize our election process to make it accessible to everyone. It shouldn't be easier to jump on Instagram than it is to vote. And we have to empower our community to ensure that every voice is heard, but we can't do it alone. It's going to take the investment of large organizations, our party's commitment to engage the Latin American community, and an all hands on deck approach. It also takes the elected officials in our city, the county, the state, and even at a federal level. We need everybody on board, because leaving it to a small group of nonprofits and political organizations, it won't suffice. You know, many like me have been fighting this fight for quite some time, but as I mentioned earlier, it takes that all hands on deck approach if we're going to have these results. But most importantly, and those that know me know this is something that's near and dear to my heart, you know, y'all know the saying, right? You know, rising tide lifts all boats. And now more than ever, communities of color, we got to stick together. You know, there truly is power in unity, and we have to come together because the oppressors are the same people. And if we come together as one, we're going to be able to succeed. So thank you all for your time, and thank you for listening.
Wow, thank you for those comments. You covered a great deal of the waterfront. I'm wondering if maybe you can say a little bit more about how you'd like to see that education of voters take place. Like, what does that really look like in the Latin communities?
You know, we got to hit the streets. We got to knock on doors. We got to build trust and relationships. Pamphlets and mailers just ain't going to cut it. You know, we truly have to have a grassroots approach, particularly supported by large organizations and our local government. Otherwise, it's if you leave it up to just small groups of nonprofits, we're going to fight and we're going to try and we're going to give it everything we got, but we need support.
Thank you so much for your comments, Jorge Miyares. And am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
Yeah, you nailed it. Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Mayor Roberts, our affirming commissioner.
Hello, Senor Miyares. It's great
Hola.
to see you. And thanks for your comments and for connecting the dots on people of color. That is the Latinx community. It's the recent immigrants. We like to call them our new citizens. Absolutely should have access. And again, I keep hearing this education, but you also touched on a couple of other things. The difficulty of getting to, if not knowing where the precinct is, and getting to that. A lot of Latinx folks are hourly workers and may not have time, you know, when the polls are open, and it is confusing. It's confusing for people who are native English speakers. So not to have that access and that information. The other key thing you mentioned is investment. And why are we leaving such an important basic tenet of democracy that people's voice can be heard and who they are represented by in the governing bodies? Why are we leaving that to nonprofits? You are absolutely right. When I look at, who's doing voter education, these are, people who get donations to try to do voter education. Why is that not a basic function of government? So thank you for emphasizing that and reminding us that this is truly the base of our democracy. It all starts there. And I'm sorry that you had that challenge when you first started voting. I'm glad that you're educating folks now and absolutely keep bringing people into their full citizenship and their right to be heard, to have access to the ballot box. And all, people of color who have been discriminated against and have been excluded and had obstacles thrown up, to band together and get this to happen. So thanks for all your terrific work.
No, thank you, Madam Mayor, and thank you for always being present in the Latin American community here in Charlotte.
Gracias. Oh, and now I am supposed to introduce our final segment. And another of our commissioners is going to take it from here. That is Jim Beard, who has been with the Reimagining America Project for a number of months and is going to introduce our next witness. I'm going to hand it over to you. Thanks, Jim.
Yes, it is my pleasure to introduce to you State Senator Jeff Jackson. Senator Jackson has became the second youngest senator in the state Senate in 2014. At that time, he was new to political office, but not new to public service, having enlisted after the attacks of September 11th, trained at Fort Bragg, and served in Afghanistan. He continues to serve today as a captain in the Army National Guard. He is currently in his 18th year of military service. In the state Senate, Jeff built a reputation for being transparent, accessible, and candid. Jeff has helped lead the fight against gerrymandering, stood against the discriminatory legislation like HB 2, supported investments in early childhood education, repeatedly called for raising teacher pay, and expanding Medicaid, passed reforms for our criminal justice system, and called out corruption where he saw it. Please join me in welcoming Senator Jackson.
I understand we're having some technical difficulties. Hang in there.
Okay.
Phone speaker.
Thank you, everyone, forgive the technical difficulties. I was saying that I've had the pleasure of listening to the last several speakers, and I appreciate their diligence in making sure that everyone in our state has the right to vote, everyone has their voice heard. As Dr. Beard said, I've been in the state Senate for the last 8 years, and it's been like getting a master class in how to defend a democracy. I've seen attacks from every angle, undermining the judicial branch, boxing in the executive, but mainly what I've seen is the majority in the legislature try to entrench itself, and it's difficult to exaggerate the extent to which they've attempted to transfer electoral power from all of our citizens toward themselves. It's been brazen, it's been repeated, and highly calculated to diminish your power as a voter. I think that it's been 57 years since the Voting Rights Act passed. We are in desperate need of an upgrade, not just fully restoring Section 5, but including new provisions. Because frankly, in the last 57 years, a lot of politicians have found ways around the original intent of the Voting Rights Act. And North Carolina has been ground zero for all of that. What we saw was the day after the Supreme Court struck down Section 5 in the Shelby case, the General Assembly filed their bill to undo a number of rights with respect to voting. And ultimately that was struck down because it was found to exist along racial lines. There was an email, and I have the language here, and this is where we bring it back to race, because a lot of folks in North Carolina, they get a sense with gerrymandering, with other headlines that they've seen, that the deck is stacked. They don't know exactly how. And some of them aren't exactly sure whether or not race is playing an explicit role in this. So when I talk to those people, what I try to do is tell them about the email that was sent to the election board from the majority party when crafting its bill right after Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act was struck down. They said, is there any way to get a breakdown of the 2008 voter turnout by race? And then they write white and black and type of vote. And then they write early and election day. They even asked UNC. They're held by black students. That is explicit and surgical targeting of voters in North Carolina, of state government, in a way that goes to the core of their power as voters. There is simply no denying that this occurred. We have the emails, we got it all in black and white. Their intent hasn't changed since then. Their methods have changed. They realize they can't have a paper trail. They have to be more sophisticated in how to execute their strategy, but the strategy is the exact same. And we saw it play out last year with redistricting, where they originally had a map that was going to be an 11-3 map that absolutely packed and cracked African-American communities and Hispanic communities all across the state for the purpose of mitigating and minimizing their electoral power. This game hasn't changed. They're simply trying different angles, different strategies for getting it through, and they came really, really close this year. If it were not for the state Supreme Court, they would have been able to absolutely rig elections in a way that is fundamentally about targeting voters of color and depriving them of their full ability to participate in our democracy. That's the core of the strategy. An earlier question from a panelist I heard, which I thought was excellent, was about Republicans and Democrats both engaging in gerrymandering. True. Certainly true for North Carolina's history. The very first bill that I ever filed in the state Senate ever, when I first got there in 2014, was a bill to end gerrymandering. And that bill was sent to the Ways and Means Committee, which hasn't met now in 20 years. That bill had been filed several times by the Republicans who had been in the minority party, and my party was back in the majority. My party threw that bill in the trash can every time the Republicans filed it, because my party thought we would never be out of power, like a bunch of geniuses. And then 2010 comes along, the backlash to Obama and Obamacare, and all of a sudden, the other party becomes the majority party, and we say, hey, great idea. How about we end gerrymandering? And they say, hey, we've got a better idea. How about epic payback? So we live now with the consequences of our sins. We could have ended this in the 1990s. We could have ended this in the 2000s, but we were greedy. Absolute power. And now they pay the price by having, instead of buried this weapon, it now transfers hands to the other party that's using it in a clearly racial way. The way that gerrymandering works in the South, very different than how it works in the North. In the South, all gerrymandering is racial gerrymandering. Racial gerrymandering is a redundant phrase in the South. All they're doing is ring fencing Black and Latino communities in order to minimize their electoral power. And this is going to be a long-term struggle. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court, Justice Kennedy, his last significant ruling, one of the worst rulings in my lifetime from the Supreme Court, said the federal court wasn't going to rule on matters of gerrymandering. They were leaving it to the state courts. Well, that they may very well now say it's no longer appropriate for the state courts to be involved either. That appeal is in front of the Supreme Court right now, and they're probably going to hear that case. And we can't have a referendum in North Carolina, like we can't do a ballot initiative where we put this on. A lot of other states have the ability to get a number of signatures and you put something on the ballot. We can't do that here. In order for all of you to vote on a constitutional amendment, it has to be passed by the General Assembly first. You all have identified a lot of long-term strategic objectives to ensure that everyone has the right to have their voice heard. This is going to be one of them. This is going to take some real time, unfortunately. We were very hopeful that maybe the election could have gone differently in the last year and we would have had the votes. Didn't turn out that way. So this is when we have conversations, when I have the benefit of addressing people about race and politics in North Carolina and our history, and how it is still with us in ways that are simply undeniable, I try to start with gerrymandering because the intent is explicit and there's no denying it. And it's always helpful when you're talking to people who don't follow politics very closely, as most people don't. They got other things going on, to show them something explicit, something that cannot be denied. There's no way to misinterpret these basic facts about how race has been weaponized with respect to redistricting. There's just too much evidence for it. I know there's so much more that we could discuss. I'm going to go ahead and stop there. I think I've taken more than enough time, and I think there may be some follow-up questions. Looking forward to it. Thank you all so much.
Yes, very, very nicely put. I had a question which may get into things that expect you to see into people's minds more than maybe you feel like you can do. But you've served in the legislature for quite a while. You've gotten to know a lot of these people along both sides of the aisle. A lot of the people who are carrying out these things in our legislature, you will find them in churches on Sunday morning. You will find them doing those sorts of things, working in civic organizations. But somehow they engage in what is obviously a campaign to disenfranchise people. Do you have any sense of how they live with themselves or how they deal with this conundrum?
What a wonderful question that goes to the psychology behind ends justifying the means, and how when people grant themselves the moral luxury of pretending that the ends justify the means, that they're able to compartmentalize the going to church, the acts of charity, the acts of benevolence, and the absolutely ruthless power grab, that they can hold both of those things in their mind at once and not feel guilt, not feel the contradiction. And I'll tell you, to a person, everyone up there is charming as heck. Everyone, well, no, I can't say to a person. There are a couple of folks who are genuinely not charming, but the vast majority, 95% of the people up there, if you just met them walking down the street, you would have a wonderful conversation. They would be very kind to you. You would feel like you could trust that person, and then they're going to go in the General Assembly and vote to rig the elections. They have simply decided that on this issue, there is too much at stake. This is literally whether or not they get to be chair of committees, whether or not they get checks from corporations and major PACs, whether or not they get reelected or not. This just goes to the heart of power. And I think there are a number of small issues where they're willing to make some concessions. We've gotten them to make some progress on criminal justice issues in the last few years. There has been a bit of sea change around criminal justice discussions with them, but that doesn't go to the seat of their power. how they vote on criminal justice bills has nothing to do with whether or not they come back or what the size of the majority is. It's purely an ideological move for them. This is bigger than ideology. This is sort of binary. Either they're in the majority or they're not. And they're just not going to let themselves obey their conscience on this, I would say.
Oh, well, thank you so very much. I appreciate it. And I'm sure everyone else did, your comments. They were very insightful. And now I will turn it over to Rodney Sadler to close this out.
Well, thank you so very much, Jim. And it was wonderful to hear from you, Brother Jeff, on what it's like in our Senate and the way that things are working in such negative ways now. And the fact that we had the chance to do something about it, and unfortunately we did not. Thank you for your honesty and for your trying to do something about this. I think tonight we've come together to hear from experts and impacted people about the way that the voting franchise has been and continues to be imperiled for Black and Brown people in the state of North Carolina, in the county of Mecklenburg, in the city of Charlotte. We know it has been a problem, and it would be nice to say that these were just things of the past, that this was just a historical reflection, but our witnesses have attested that this is a problem that continues to linger even to this very day. It is difficult to imagine that after we have been a nation since 1776, that some of these basic issues about who is and who is not able to vote, how should elections be handled, how should districts be drawn, have not been settled matters yet. And worse off, that these issues continue to be plagued by the lie that is race, and by a desire, an open desire, an explicit desire for some to gain partisan political advantage at the extent of those who have been racialized as others in this context. We've got a lot of work to do, my sisters and brothers. We've got a lot of work to do. I want to say thank you tonight for Dr. William Chafe and Ms. Kamaria Lawrence for establishing the historical context upon which this conversation has taken place. I want to say thank you to Attorney Byers Bailey, Mr. Kendrick Cunningham, Mr. Brandon Rivers, and Mr. Jorge Miyares for telling their own stories, their personal stories, touching stories, refusals of access to the polls, inability to be treated equally because of their identity, fighting for rights and testifying that we will not let a single election go by without participating. I'm grateful for those stories and for what they've done to forward this larger narrative of the need to protect every American's right to vote. And thank you, Senator Jeff Jackson, for your testimony that takes us inside the halls of political power in our nation and the way that we have used political power, racialized political power, and harmed so many people in the attempt of some to gain access to wealth, power, and privilege. Dare I say that the same thing that you say about the way that gerrymandering has been used in the state of North Carolina is much the same thing that we could say about the issue of race itself. Race is just a means of determining who has access to wealth, power, and privilege. This is unfortunately what we see playing out in our political processes as well. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this important conversation. Please note that this conversation continues. Next Thursday night, we're going to have a follow-up conversation. The struggle continues. What can you do? And this will give us some things, some ideas about ways that we can be involved, things that we can participate in, invite our neighbors, our friends, our children, our colleagues to participate in with us, in order that we can make sure that every human being has their right to vote protected and their dignity as human beings respected. Grateful for all that you are doing in this community. So many of you are involved in not just the Reimagining America Project, but other good work to make this country live up to its ideals and its credos. Let us close tonight with a word of prayer. God, for each and every person that has spoken tonight, we want to say thank you. Each and every commissioner that has given us access to the insights and thoughts of our witnesses, we want to say thank you. Everyone that has lifted a word in support of a larger vision, a vision of justice and equality, and just the simple single person right to vote that we seem to think of as inherent, yet that continues to elude us as Americans. May we go forward from this night in pondering, Lord, pondering what we can do to improve the situation, Lord. May we reimagine the systems that are in place, that we might think about something better, and may we be tireless in our efforts to work until we manifest that better world. Lord, we call on you by many names, and all of them we remain grateful to you, and we ask that you would use us for your purposes. Amen. Amen. Amen.